I'm Al McFarland. Welcome to the conversation with Al McFarland. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Well, as you can see, I'm enjoying a wonderful, beautiful fall day operating from my deck at the back of my house in North Minneapolis. I'd say beautiful North Minneapolis. I've heard people who are residents, natives here, use the term NFL in reference to this community. NFL, they say, means North Side for life. And I have that feeling because I've been here most of the time that I've lived in Minnesota. I've lived here in North Minneapolis most of the time, and I love this community. I love the fact that over the past week, I had a chance to visit a ribbon cutting at the historic North High School. And North High School, I think originally built in the 18 somethings, but rebuilt in about 1974 into its current campus on, I think, James and 16th or so in North Minneapolis. And when it was built like in two campuses or two buildings with a space between the two buildings that was both, practical and weird in a certain way because there was a creek beneath or a sewer drain that was in a space that they plowed over, not plowed over, but paved over to make a plaza between these two buildings. So one big building, but almost a east campus and a west campus with a space in between. Well, the district went through a lot of changes like all districts have over the past years because of changing, shifting populations, the number of people leaving communities, going to suburbs, etc. And the loss of population meant the school district had to decide how to use its assets, its buildings. And there was a real threat that North High, which is a historic institution, would be shut down. Well, the community rallied. Community wasn't hearing it, protested, organized, and did registration and enrollment drives and got people to rethink and recognize and embrace the value of having a quality education originate here in North Minneapolis. And this week, there was a ribbon cutting of the repurposing of that plaza, the place that had been the plaza between two buildings, covered and created new space, and it was absolutely beautiful. So in the future, I did some interviews with different people, the superintendent, the state commissioner of education, the principal of the school, and some of the architects that were involved in creating it. You'll be really pleased to hear those conversations in the future when we edit those and put those as part of our conversation. Well, all that to say, what a beautiful day in Minneapolis. What a beautiful day in North Minneapolis. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Fridays, we call this the Healing Circle. Let me bring in my co-host today, Dr. Oliver Williams is here. Our partner, Dr. B, is not on board today. But Brother Oliver, good to see you. How you doing, man?
I'm good, brother. I'm hanging in there.
Good to see house family and everybody.
Everybody's doing well. Can't complain.
Good. Well,
Yeah.
we've got a wonderful guest today, Sister Jojo Bell, Dr. Jojo Bell, I think it is. If I'm not correct, she'll correct me. But she's got a book that is called Red Stained, The Life of Hilda Sims. And it's a book published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. We're going to talk to her about the book and about her life here in Minnesota. And we'll talk about the world as we always do. But I told her that we'd begin the program with a wonderful protocol. I'm
Yeah.
going to ask you to introduce the show through the
No.
protocol today.
Well, what we do on the show is we sort of share the talking stick, and that's sort of an African tradition. And one of the things that we do with the stick is that we would talk in a circle. And with the circle, one of the things that is interesting is the fact that the hierarchy isn't the traditional thing from top down. It's shared in the circle, and if people want to get a chance to talk, they share it and ask for the talking stick. One of the things that is also wonderful about the talking circle is that there are things that we sort of respect. One of the things is the fact that it doesn't, again, have a hierarchy. But the other thing that we do is we recognize things. among the things that we recognize is we recognize uh, the folks that are our ancestors, and we recognize people who are our elders, and we recognize our elders because our elders are closest to God. So what we want to do is to sort of use the symbolism with regard to asking for the talking stick when we want to get a chance to, have a conversation, or you have something to say, you want to share the talking stick and ask for it. So with that, I'll take it back to Brother Al.
Well, thank you, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much. And this has been a wonderful experience. What is exciting to me is that when I was in Ghana over several occasions, I had lots of meetings with people in community and education and government and leadings. And what I remember is that every time a group of 3 or 5 or 10 or 12 would meet in a business meeting or discussion or whatever, the meetings always had a certain start, a certain way to start. And it's what we just did at one level or another. The idea was that each speaker and the convener of the meeting, number one, addressed the connection between the now and the shoulders, as Dr. Williams said, that we all stand on, and in acknowledging the the power of the present moment as a slice of eternity. We claimed and promised to seek to be true to the legacy, to those who came before, who were in the space and in this discussion using these words. And we also, however, acknowledge the presence and the inevitability of those that will follow. So it gives us the chance to talk both from antiquity and into the future in a way that's seamless, that's genuine, and it kind of guides our thoughts and our feelings and contextualizes the importance of the moment. So that's the spirit of this, and that's why I love doing this. And I have suggested to Dr. B that we should try to figure out ways to establish a protocol as part of the training that we all have. How we, when we gather in family, as friends, have a process. Here's how we do it, and institutionalize this relationship that is based on hearing, listening, speaking with respect, and encouraging the very best and expecting the very best of ourselves and of others that we are engaged with. Well, with that, let me invite our guest today, Jojo Bell. And Jojo Bell is the author of a book we're going to talk about and more. Jokeda. Jojo Bell is the executive director and director of exhibitions and programming for the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota. It's called AAICM. Her roles within the organization have led to a collaborative programming with institutions like the Minnesota Historical Society and like the Minnesota Museum of African American Art. She's also appeared as an expert in the Minnesota Historical Society's documentary, Storied African Americans in World War II. In 2019, Jojo Bell curated the Builders Exposition, the Builders Exhibition for AAICM, which was named one of the top 10 art exhibitions of the year by the Star Tribune. Bell is a PhD student. I called her Dr. Bell in the history department at the University of Minnesota. Her research interests include Black women and land ownership in the upper Midwest, and she lives here in Maple Grove, Minnesota. May I call you Jojo, or welcome to the program, first of all. How should I address you, Jojo?
Yeah, hey, yeah, you can call me JoJo. I'll take the doctor title. I'm kidding. But yeah, I was a PhD student last year and I passed my prelims, so now I'm a PhD candidate.
Awesome. Well, congratulations and
Thanks.
hats off to you. Applause, applause, applause. Thank you
Mhm.
for being here. And let's just start by asking you to step right in and talk about this book. I've got a copy here. We've got some images of it to show. But let's
Right.
have you talk about Red Stained, the life of Hilda Sims, and why this is so important as a
Mhm.
Minneapolis-based story.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand the talking stick to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so this book really came out of just researching, topics that we're not familiar with in Minnesota history. I was trying to do that for AAICM, and that was when I was just putting presentations together about these histories. And as I was researching and trying to find out more information about Hilda, I noticed that there wasn't a book about her. And
Mhm.
I was like, there's that can't be possible, right? Because, and for those of you who've read it, you know that she's, really been important in these important moments through the 40s, and even well into the 60s, with people like Sidney Poitier. And so the fact that there wasn't a longer biography on her was very surprising to me. So, I kind of just looked around online, wondered if there were digital archives. There weren't. Her papers at the Schoenberg Center for Black Research in New York. So I actually did two trips there, self-funded, and those people who are scholars know that's kind of kind of a thing, kind of a big thing to do by yourself. But yeah, so I went to New York and went to the archives basically, um, and just read as much as I could from the files that she left. So those papers are things that she left behind, that she wanted to preserve, right? And so a way that she wanted her story to be told. Like I said, I went through as much as possible. There's still some files I would love to go back and look at, and so I think her story is an important Minneapolis story, because I think it again ties Minneapolis to some of these national movements that were happening at the period. And I feel like, Minnesota history is already siloed itself, right? Then there's, even less knowledge about Black Minnesota history. So I just wanted to show the connection that, Hilda had an opportunity to kind of gain some experience being activist, if you will, and I'm not sure she would even call herself that here. And that really influenced her life in New York.
Okay, so from your the press release on the book, let me share some of the statements, and then have you go into it more than that. The press documents say that Hilda Sims, they called her both a black actress and an activist, was a rising star, and on the stage and screen in post-World War II America, until accusations of the un-Americanism and communist sympathies derailed her career. That's a big deal. We all know the McCarthy
Mhm.
era. Here now is the unveiling of it in our personal space here in Minnesota. So it's a connection that's important. And she emerged as an actress at a time when segregation was deeply entrenched in Hollywood and on Broadway. Black performers were mostly relegated to bit parts, stereotype characters, or comic relief roles, if they were hired at all. And after joining Harlem's uh, American Negro Theater in 1943, she became immersed in a vibrant community of African American performers and writers and other artists. And over the next two decades, she helped chart a path for Black actors who wanted to be considered serious dramatists and tell stories that spoke to the true experience of African Americans. The piece goes on to say that, as you mentioned, she was born and raised in Minneapolis and studied at Hampton Institute, now it's Hampton University, before she moved on to New York. Um, let's see, uh, she spoke openly about civil rights and uh, was sympathetic in her comments about the anti-racist policies of the Soviet Union, and that uh, gave and allowed her to get the attention of the U.S. Department of Justice. Her passport was revoked. She had to cancel some plans to perform for American troops stationed in Europe. She was effectively blacklisted from Hollywood, and it marked the beginning of the end of her promising acting career. What a story! What a story! So, as you came across this information, what feelings did you have? And maybe start by reading some of what you wrote. Maybe
Okay,
there's a
sure.
passage you selected, and then we'll go from there to questions. I'm gonna hand the talking stick
Yeah.
back to you, Jojo.
Okay. I think I'd like again just connecting it to a Minnesota story, I'll read something from the first chapter, which really details her life in Minneapolis. In the summer of 1937, after graduating from St. Margaret's, Hilda began to work at Minneapolis's Phyllis Wheatley House, a historically black settlement home. Wheatley provided Hilda with the opportunity to explore activism and acting within the confines of the small but influential black community of Minneapolis. The settlement house movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries didn't miss Minneapolis. The Phyllis Wheatley House opened in 1924 with the primary goal of providing social services to the growing number of single Black women coming into the city during the Great Migration.
Awesome. That's great. So I'm sitting about a mile from Phyllis Wheatley right now.
Mhm.
And so that makes it really personal. It's wonderful to read stories like this, that you can look at the landmarks, places you've worked, that you've lived, that you've enjoyed. My children went to daycare at Phyllis Wheatley
Oh, wow. Yeah.
back in the day. And I think way back when, I did some of the promotion for Phyllis Wheatley's 75th anniversary. So that
Okay.
connection makes it really real. So tell me more about her and
Mhm.
her challenges and the
Yeah.
successes that she was experiencing until her career got derailed.
Yeah. I think there are two kind of main themes of her life that kind of, you know, moved her story along. And I think the first thing is race. So how she was perceived, and for two, how she defined herself. She had a lighter complexion, and sometimes studios would reach out and ask her to play certain roles that weren't necessarily Black women. But as best as she could, she always wanted to identify as a Black woman. Um, and so I think that was really important to her. And obviously, race is important growing up in Minneapolis when it was, it's a small Black population, even though we are mighty, as you can say, small but mighty. And then I think the second thing is just her outspokenness as a woman, particularly. It starts with some of her, admiration of, like you said, the anti-communist policies of the Soviet Union, and goes through how like Black actors aren't always guaranteed um, parts, right? So you might go and apply or try to audition, but right? Like just know unspoken that you're probably not going to get the part. So I would say every facet of her life, she is very direct, open, um, professional. But again, this is a woman in the 1940s. She died in 1994. But like, during the majority of her career was pretty outspoken. And I think that sometimes could backfire.
As you did the research, what would you say she would call as the highlights of her career and of her life? If you had to, through your book, sort of give voice to what she presented. You mentioned earlier that you had a chance to view the notes of
Mhm.
the story that she wanted to preserve, and you sort of had an appointment, right,
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
discover and to engage and to deliver on the expectation, the desire. So talk about what those high points were in the arc of
Mhm.
her life.
Yeah, well, I definitely think, she was in a play called Anna LaCosta, running from 1943-ish to 1945, on Broadway. So that's a highlight. But I would say even in the years preceding the actual play, which is about a sex worker and her family. But even before the play, I think even just joining the American Negro Theater, or ANT, was probably really a highlight for her as well, because she got to work with other actors who were serious about drama. And not just serious about individually being in drama, but also just trying to change um, how people get parts, what parts they get, what stories are focused on. So the play is kind of referred to as the first play that focuses on that is colorblind, right? That doesn't focus on color. And it was running around the same time as Carmen Jones as well. So this push to just show the humanity of Black people, and that really was the ethos of the American Negro Theater. So I think that whole period in her life is probably a highlight. I think Europe was definitely a highlight. but it's interesting because she also mentions that you would think the perception is it's easier for Black stars to, you know, get parts there, get paid there, but she still faced a few of the roadblocks that you would see in the US too in terms of getting paid. So she voices that as well. But I think traveling through Europe was definitely a highlight for her. She got married there, to her second husband there. And yeah, well, let's see other highlights, I guess, after. I mean, obviously working with Langston Hughes, and I think for her going back to school later, and really starting to get behind the scenes with some of the work she was doing in terms of trying to ensure that actors of colors were getting parts, or at least getting taken seriously for the parts that they auditioned for.
Any stories that illustrate that?
hmm Yeah, so she actually was asked to testify before Congress, and she testified at the Employment Practices in the Performing Arts before. That's the committee that she testified before, and that was around, I think, around 1962. And she really voiced everything that she went through as an actress, as a Black woman, too. So she even mentioned how, even trying to do radio spots, like sounding white or sounding Black, could also, right, stop you from um, getting those parts. So I think, yeah, I think that's kind of one example of her working behind the scenes. You know, she also worked with the state of New York as well on so the New York State Commission on Human Rights, where she collected research basically on how Black people were perceived on film and TV. Again, what kind of parts were they getting? How much, what pay were they getting?
I mentioned the McCarthy era. I think
Mhm,
the time we're talking about is after that. Sentiment of McCarthyism still flourished, I think, late into the time where she was emerging as an
mhm,
artist. And I think the sentiment also played a part. Let me ask Dr. Oliver to come in. Dr. Oliver, you have any questions or comments or thoughts or observations so far? I want to pass the talking stick to you.
Thank you. There's a couple of things I was curious about. So we're talking about the McCarthy era, which was really late 40s and 50s,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so one of the things that I wondered about JoJo was
mhm,
what is how I don't know, how does she speak to you?
mhm,
So what in her narrative uh, did you draw from her
mhm.
story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's hard to kind of think about that just because as I was researching, I was just more like impressed with her life.
Mhm,
I was impressed with the amount of work she was able to do. I was impressed that, she had this creative side, but she also was very intelligent and just pursued that as well.
mhm,
So I think that really spoke to me, that her tenacity as a person through everything she did.
mhm.
Um, yeah, I think that's what spoke to me the most, probably.
What other roles did she play? So you
hmm
mentioned that she wanted to continue to play Black women in her
Yeah,
presentation, but what other cultures did she
yeah.
uh, manifest in her work?
Uh-huh. So in Europe, she was in a play called Hassan, and um, I believe her character was Indian. But and I'm not sure where I put this in the book, but her niece Nanette, who still lives here on the north side, did share with me when she did talk to her aunt that she would get roles, or she would get offers for roles to play example, an Italian woman, and she turned it down.
Hmm. So was it South Asian women or was it
South,
South
yeah,
Asian women?
hmm
Not
yeah,
Native American.
hmm
Yeah.
correct, yeah.
Yeah. And so
Mhm,
what would she say? I've always been interested. My dad was born, I keep saying this, was born in 1898.
oh wow,
And
okay.
so, and when he was alive, we got a chance to sort of talk about what his life was like and what he had to endure. I remember he and my uncle ended up hopping a freight train to get to from South Carolina, from Anderson, South Carolina, to get to Detroit, Michigan. And then
Yeah.
he built a life there, and then sort of brought his brothers and sisters and my grandfather up to Detroit.
Mhm.
And Detroit was an interesting experience, an interesting place to sort of uh, grow up during his time, but also during my time.
Mhm.
Um, and the things that he learned how to do, and the things that he was in, and the restrictions that existed were interesting issues and barriers. But it was interesting to me to see people who, with as much discrimination as existed,
Mhm.
one of my godparents' uh, uh, son was a physician,
Mhm. Wow.
and yeah, and he's about, I guess, a similar age as my dad,
Mhm.
and interesting seeing the challenges that he had, but also the challenges that Dr. Billingsley had,
Mhm.
and trying to go through what he went through. My godparents were teachers, and then their daughters were teachers.
Mhm.
But then Dr. Billingsley ended up becoming a physician, and to see the challenges that he had, was a real respected person. So as you tell her story,
Mhm.
I was just wondering what she would identify
Mhm.
as some of her challenges, and
Mhm.
what types of discrimination she
Mhm.
went through, but how did she endure?
Mhm.
That's the thing that I think about with my dad, is that he found a way to be able to endure, all the um, disrespect
Mhm.
that existed. So, what can you tell me about her?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
About her endurance.
yeah, and what
Ye-
she had to endure.
Yeah. Again, I would bring it back to her acting, obviously, because that was, really important to her. She also had a few well, two radio shows technically.
Hmm.
Again, it's for her specifically, I would say it's really gendered. I have a chapter on Chicago where she's kind of trying to negotiate her first billing or how her name appears um, as they're getting ready to go to Europe, and then also pay. So I just imagine this Black woman here in the 40s, 50s, 40s at this time, you know, talking to these white producers and really directly asking for exactly what she thought she was worth or what she
Mhm.
deserved for her work. So I couldn't imagine how like that would produce a lot of anxiety for me, right? Because there are a couple of things that could happen. They could try to replace her with an understudy or somebody maybe who wouldn't ask those questions. So she was really weighing these risks of how much to speak out
Hmm.
and how much, what is that how is that going to affect her career? And to answer Dr. Williams's question, I think how she endured really was really leaning into her circle.
Hmm.
So in the book, I talk about these connections that she had in New York. And really, she stayed in touch with people from Anna Lacosta Place she was in, like Alice Childress, like Canada Lee. Um, so I think being in that environment and atmosphere and having this kind of social circle that she built, right? Because again, she's from Minneapolis
Yeah.
via Virginia to New York. Um, so I think just leaning on them and learning from them as well. She kind of mentions that. Uh, or sorry, I mentioned that in the book too. And also like some of her the people she was in play with were also surveilled by the government too. So I think that there was a solidarity there that existed
Hmm.
that may have like given her enough, courage and like you said, endurance to, keep pushing.
Yeah. I always think about that, the disrespect that
Mhm.
we've had to experience during different periods of, the time, and you
Mhm.
know, my life was much better than my dad's life,
Mhm.
and but my dad's life may have been much better than my grandfather's life.
Mhm.
Mhm.
The fact that they had the great migration from the South to the North,
Mhm.
to be able to find jobs that existed in the city of Detroit. And my dad managed to find his way and, live very well.
Yeah.
But, all the challenges that he had to deal with too, you know,
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you mentioned those challenges and the periods you're talking about, right?
Right.
Um, and I was, interested in really sharing another passage from the book that kind of relates to that, not directly to Hilda, but to, the Phyllis Wheatley House, as it
Yeah.
was called then, right?
Sure.
Right.
And I think this ties in the Minnesota connection, obviously, as well. But I said, as the Depression ravaged the country, Black Minnesotans found themselves hit harder than their white neighbors
Right.
during the Great Depression. So Gertrude Brown, the first Black head resident of Wheatley, working in conjunction with an all-white board, recounted the disparities she witnessed in an annual report. And this is a quote from her. Unfortunately, we have suffered a little longer than the other fellow. The Negro was the first to be let out of jobs and the last to be taken back. From November 1st to December 1st, and then parentheses 1933, only 5 people were placed through our program, or sorry, through our employment bureau. It's terrible to have to say constantly, I'm sorry, there's no work for you this morning. It has been extremely hard to keep up the morale of our people during these distressing days. So I think it really relates to what you were saying, right?
Yeah.
The simplest things or things we just think are simple
Mm.
weren't in that period.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious as to the conversations you have with relatives of hers
Mhm.
and what stories they tell you today or during the course of your research. Can you sort of
Mhm.
give us an idea of the people you met and came to know, what your feelings were? And I'm also curious, Jojo, about, I think this is the same question that Dr. Oliver asked earlier,
Mhm.
is how you
Mhm.
internalize the experience in order to allow you to produce this work, the book,
Mhm.
Red Stains. What impact has
Mhm.
that had on you as an
Oh,
individual?
dear.
But talk
Oh,
about the people that you came across who were her family members. You mentioned some of them still live here in North Minneapolis. So what
mhm.
are those connections?
Yeah, and I just think, she came from a large family. And so, a lot of her family's still in North Minneapolis. And I got actually to connect with who had become a good friend now, Nanette Moses. And she's Hilda's niece. So I think when I was just doing the presentation on Hilda, I posted it on Facebook through our organization, AAICM. And we were just talking about how did we meet? But I really do believe it's when she sent a message back saying, "Oh, hey, Hilda was my aunt," and I was like, "What? Like, there's somebody still, like connected to her who's still
Mhm.
here." So it's like I definitely have to talk to her.
Mm.
So we talked to each other, throughout the whole process of writing this book. I think I started it, I want to say at least 6 years ago.
Mhm.
And I should mention the FBI files maybe in a different section. But was writing it for years, and through those years, I really developed a friendship with Annette. She told me stories about Hilda, like remembering her visits from New York and how she
Mm.
smelled good all the time, how she always
Hmm.
was put together, and how she would pinch Nanette's cheeks, right? So it really personalized her and made me see her as a human for the biography, right? Not just symbols of fighting oppression, but
Mm.
as a real person. So yeah, that I'd say, and that's maybe the one family member I connected with. However, at the book signing that we had at Strive Bookstore, she brought more of her family there. So I got to meet more of her family and, be connected that way as well. And
Mm.
it's just crazy because we both come from big families with more women than men, and just so many connections that way that kind of really even tied to Hilda's story.
Jojo, are you from the Twin Cities?
Mhm. Yeah, so I was born in Minneapolis, And when I was two, me and my mom moved to Hopkins. So it's a Hopkins school district. Yeah, till I graduated.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, that's a wonderful pivot. Let's focus on you. Tell your story. And this is your first book, or and
Yeah,
not your last, I'm sure.
I hope not. We'll
Uh,
see. Yeah.
talk about your story. I'm curious. I mean, weave into your story this research you've done, the impressions, the impact of the people you met, the discoveries of being curious, being inquisitive, and identifying, as you said, as you did the research, you were surprised that
Mhm,
what there wasn't a book, and that let you know, that kind of instructed you that
mhm,
you've got a mission, and that is
mhm,
to bring this story forward in the form of a book. And you have done that with Red Stained, The Life
mhm,
of Hilda Sims. But talk about who Jojo Bell is,
mhm,
where you grew up,
mhm,
in the metro area, and who you thought you would become, and who
mhm.
you have become so far.
That's a really cool question. Who you thought you would become? Um, I guess we'll start with who I am. So, even when I was little, I loved to just read. I had a little reading nook at school that I would just escape to. So I think reading was always something that was important to me. I didn't know if that would, obviously when I'm little, I'm not thinking, oh, I'm going to be an academic, right? Or a public historian. So I think it's just the love of reading that is a through line in my life. My mom used to write a lot. Now, she didn't write nonfiction or fiction, but like whenever she's filling out any kind of documents, she's going to write like pages, right? She's going to be very detailed and direct. And I really do feel like some of the writing actually came from her in that way, very
Mhm.
indirectly. So I grew up really into books, really into reading, and this is kind of funny. I tell people this. So later in like junior high and high school, I really got into Anne Rice books. So for those who don't know, Anne Rice, she was an author who wrote about vampires in the 80s and 90s. And the popular movie was Interview with the Vampire with Brad Pitt and Christian Slater and
Mhm.
Tom Cruise.
I'm good.
Yeah. So I saw that movie and I was like, oh, I want to read the book, right? So then she has a chronicle of like vampire stories. But how it relates to my interest is she would talk about the history of New Orleans as well. So and Black New Orleans too. So that just fascinated me. That was where I learned that there were free people of color in New Orleans. Like I hadn't learned that in school, right? Even though I was in middle school, high school.
Right.
Um, and some of these histories that are not necessarily hidden, but I always focused on. So I think from there is really a jumping point to learn more about New Orleans, actually. So originally, I wasn't even focused on Black Minnesota history, and that was probably second year of college where I started to think about New Orleans as a place I want to study. Again, I'm not a Southerner, but my mom is, and then on her side of the family, all the women go back to Louisiana. So I was like, oh my God, this book connecting it to New
Mhm.
Orleans and sorry, to Louisiana, and wanted to do kind of family research that way as well. But then I just after school I realized, well, here are these stories about Black people. But I was like, where are our stories, right? Because again, I'm not a Southerner, I'm from Minnesota. So it's like it's not even that ours were people are starting to write books about that, like Dr. William Green. So I'm not saying nobody was looking at this, but um, there just didn't seem to be stories that reflected Black people, Black women, and especially in periods before like the 1980s. So I think there's this perception that Blackness is kind of like a new thing in Minnesota.
Mhm.
But people like George Bunga, 1800s, right,
Mhm.
who lived here, who were born here. What
Mhm.
were their stories? What was it like to be a Black fur trapper and voyageur, right? And and I so even in my work in my PhD program, I kind of opposite of what my book is, I'm trying to focus on Black families in the 1800s. Um, and before the Great Migration, as Dr. Williams mentioned, starting around 1915. So yeah, just being curious about these things, also to connect to family, but then looking and saying, identifying as a Minnesotan. I think people don't always identify Black people, even even our even other Black people don't, right? It's funny because I lived in Louisiana for a little bit, and this guy was like, "Oh," he's like, "You have an accent. Are you from the islands?" And I'm like, like, nope, I'm from Minnesota. So, just connecting that. Like, I identify as a Black Minnesotan. Where are these stories that reflect my life, right? Or that could give me stories about life in Black Minnesota. So,
Where have you traveled in your life so far? What
yeah.
parts of the country or parts of the world have you seen?
Yeah. So, yeah, the South, so Louisiana, Texas, New York. I went to New York to do the research for Hilda's book, for the book on Hilda. I'm like, ooh, trying to remember where else. I think in 2019, right before the pandemic hit, I went to Europe and I visited Paris and Britain, which was just like, a trip of a lifetime. Um, and where else? Oh yeah, I've been to the Dominican Republic as well. Thinking. There's probably other places I'm leaving out. Well, Wisconsin. But I feel like if you're Minnesota, you probably, you know, been to Wisconsin a bunch of times. So Wisconsin and yeah.
And I asked the question just to get a sense
Mhm,
of how that travel uh,
mhm,
gives you a perspective on how
yeah.
you see the world today, how you see our people showing up, how you show up as an educated and learning
Mhm,
and teaching individual.
mhm,
Uh, yeah, you didn't say this exactly, but you
mhm,
said that too often we know so little about our own selves, and that we somehow are left with the impression that we just showed up in the 80s and 90s. But
mhm,
the truth is, we've been here a long time. You made reference to George Bongo and others,
mhm,
lots of families, lots of the Hilda Sims story. And
mhm,
so, as you move around, what are you learning about both yourself and about us as a people
mhm,
and the environment that we're operating in? What's the source of this question? The source of this question is your sense of what we have done and what we need to do,
okay.
a sense of freedom, a sense of power, a sense of place, a sense of equity in the universe.
Mhm.
Big question. Any way you want to take it, just
Yeah.
jump in on it.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think the first part of your question is pretty interesting because we're kind of, we think of ourselves as divided by geography, right? Because where we live shapes us. That's
Right.
just a fact. However, as you move around, as you talk to family, you realize it's, in some instances you have the same problems, right? Like I think people tend to see, even the Midwest, but Minnesota is this very liberal place where there weren't really many obstacles to get over as Black people. But I think Hilda's story, even talking about the Phyllis Wheatley house, shows that there were, they were just maybe in a different lens or looked at in a different way.
Right.
Um, and that there's a sense of community too, right? Like there's a sense of community with Black people in Minnesota, whether that's in Rondo, whether that's in North Minneapolis, whether that's you just moved to Maplewood and you want to meet other people. And I
Mhm.
think that's traveling is kind of made me think these things because I see how people see us, but it's not always pretty true. And I think there was a second part to your question.
Well, so moving around and connecting with our people in different cities and around, say, in Europe,
Mhm,
as part of your research and part of your just movement as an individual,
mhm,
what does it make you feel about our our quest
mhm,
for freedom? I mean, I
mhm,
don't think that anybody in this country or in the world that is that as a as a matter of fact can deny uh, we have been in a constant fight for dignity and for the recognition of our humanity.
Mhm.
And that fight comes from our connection with Europe in particular, but there are more ways to look at that that you really transcend our experience as Africans with. But so the undergirding theme of all of our lives has to be, from my point of view,
Mhm.
how do we experience a sense of sovereignty means a sense of dignity, a sense of worth, and a sense of ownership and authorship in the creation of futures that reflect our presence. One of the things you said was that, life was happening at Phyllis Wheatley and other places, and we knew what was going on, but the world kind of didn't know.
Mhm.
And even though we experienced the discrimination, there was an overlay, a story, a narrative from outside that tried to tell the rest of the world and even have us believe that we were okay, that things
Mhm.
were all right, and they weren't as bad as had been elsewhere. But when
Mhm.
we peel the covers off of that, pull the curtain back, we see the same racial discrimination, the same impact, the same insidious
Mhm.
supremacist thought that
Mhm.
led to continued marginalization of Black people in
Mhm.
Minnesota, just like everywhere else. And at
Yeah.
the same time, the story that you are telling is a testament to this resilience and this attitude of overcoming. And
Yeah.
so that story of our overcoming is a story that's hidden from us.
Right.
And I think that what you are doing as the author, as an observer, is shattering uh,
Mhm.
that uh, uh, that illusion,
Mhm.
and allowing a truth to emerge that allows us to breathe and to be differently. I don't know. I'm just
Right.
uh,
Yes. Yeah.
so.
And I mean, to me, and this is just like my personal take. I don't think this is a very um maybe common way to look at it, but I think if we're talking about freedom, I think the freest you can be is when you can be yourself, is you can, you know, and walk through life as you are, no matter what that really means, and how that ties to the book, but also just my work in general is a sense of belonging. I think what I'm trying to do, part of my mission, is to establish a sense of belonging for Black people who are born in Minnesota or who have spent, decades here. That this could be, you don't have to feel like Blackness doesn't belong in the North, right? You're right, it's a different way of being maybe, but like we said, that has intersections on really important things, like rights. So I think for me, I think my quest for that is to just to show that, and I hope I showed it with Hilda. But again, I'm also doing some research on Black families, and I do wonder, what things I'll learn about how did they make a place sense of, how did they have a sense of belonging? How
Mhm.
did they, basically put roots down that are similar from, people on the East Coast, West Coast, South, or the same? So that's just kind of what I'm interested in.
Well, take a minute then, if you would, Jojo, and talk about the work of the African American
Mhm.
Interpretive Center of
Mhm.
Minnesota. I'm not familiar with the organization, so I'm
Yeah.
pleased to learn about it
Mhm.
and its relationship with the Minnesota Historical Society and the Minnesota Museum of American Art. Talk about that work and what your
Yeah.
mission and vision are in that capacity.
And I think it sprang from the same place as wanting to establish a sense of belonging. But oh, I'm like forgetting what year. I think it was 2016. I was looking for jobs at the Historical Society that are tied, obviously I'm a historian tied to history. And I just wasn't getting those jobs. But also I really wanted to do research on Black Minnesota as well. So I just thought that maybe I could just start with like a small exhibition, see if there's any interest out there. I suspected there was. I mean, I couldn't be the only person who was wondering, about Black life before a certain time or in different contexts. And so our first one was, I'm forgetting the title, but it's basically Minnesota's Black past. So, it was a photo exhibition of Black people in Minnesota using the archives from the Minnesota Historical Society. So some, known people like George Bongo we featured, but also, um, there's a large collection of unidentified persons, right? So we included those people too because, it's easy to tell the stories of people who are well known or easier, but, letting them speak in a way, even though it's a photo exhibition, you know, through that. So that was the first year. And from there, it's like, interest grew, which I felt really lucky about. And I made some really cool connections with people, you know, um, throughout Black Minnesotans who are like really tied to the community here. And I think from there and with that support, I was able to kind of focus on some of the different things that I wanted to do. So it is not, so the name is a little bit misleading, and maybe it was hopeful. So we don't have an actual physical place. However, we do pop-ups, and we have done that at the Minnesota Historical Society, at the the Museum of American Art at the Inn, which was also during the pandemic. And where else? Mill City Museum, New Rules. We had an exhibition there. So just trying to go kind of anywhere people would have us, basically. So we focus on exhibitions and events centered on Black Minnesota history. So we had a talk about World War I and Black families in World War I. Dr. Rose Brewer was on the panel for that, which was pretty cool.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's our work, is to just tell some of these stories that I just feel are interesting, but also important, again, for a sense of belonging.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting to me, as that question that Al asked earlier about what has your travels taught you?
Hmm.
You know, for me, it's trying to find places where I see my people,
Yep.
and finding Black people in England
Hmm.
was much different than finding Black people in Germany.
Hmm.
But finding Black people in Germany, it was interesting tracing their histories because they were there during the time that they were trying to kill Jews,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they were treated Black people pretty badly.
Hmm.
But it was interesting to me that there was a co-narrative of other issues that took place for our people in Germany during that same period of time,
Hmm.
and how we were devalued. But and also in the UK, what's fascinating to me is you've got people from different parts of the world who end up in England, who see themselves as unique to their country, but at the same time they can see themselves in one another too, to a greater or lesser extent.
Hmm.
This young man saw himself as a proper British gentleman until he had to deal with racism by
Hmm.
the Northern Front. Do you
Hmm.
know what the Northern Front is? It's
Hmm.
like a, British version of the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay.
Hmm.
And so there was a woman that he saw as a client who saw him as a Black man, and she ended up accusing him of doing things that he hadn't done.
Hmm.
Her boyfriend was the leader of the Northern Front in that part of the UK. He ended up switching his point of view about the experiences of racism from what it was before to a new experience, given the context of what he had to deal with and live through.
Hmm.
Fascinating sets of issues that he had to deal with. And so people who were drawn to you, had a friend, he said he had to come to the United States to find out what it meant to be a Black man,
Hmm.
given some of the challenges and experiences that he had to deal with, but the issue of identity and how you could crystallize the issue
Hmm.
is something that he found is important. And I I find it interesting that, we have to find ourselves
Mhm.
and then try to deal with the commonality of experiences,
Mhm.
and then the different dimensions which you greater or lesser extent to which you deal with the issues and such.
Mhm.
To me, versus
Yeah,
camp.
yeah, and there's a poet I'm including some of my research and I'm forgetting his name too, because why not? But he's talking about this, and academics love to come up with fake words, but multitudinous of blackness. And I think that really, kind of matches up with what you're saying, Dr. Worms,
Mhm.
about how you can find blackness anywhere, and you may think it's different in certain ways, and it may be. However, we're still facing really, anti-blackness
Right,
globally.
right.
Mhm.
The
As
challenge.
you were speaking, I had a couple of memories. One of them was that I interviewed Yelena Kanga, who was a Soviet-born black woman
Mm,
who born and raised there and was a noted journalist and wrote a book. I can't remember the name of the book now. I just
Mhm.
thought it was amazing that as a journalist, I was talking to a journalist who was born in Soviet Union. Then I
mm,
also thought about experience. I spent some time in Moscow and in St. Petersburg,
mm.
and I had a feeling when I was walking down the street. I was away from the group that I was there with, and walking down the street in the evening in St. Petersburg and saw this group of, white guys, Russian guys, walking. I saw them 2 blocks away, but what I felt and what guided me and how I acted was my body memory of
Yeah,
danger.
Mm.
right.
These were young white boys uh, of the drinking age and the drinking hour.
Mhm.
Right, on a
Mhm.
dark street. I'm solo black
Right.
man in a country that's not mine. And so, intuitively, instinctively, and without a second thought, I crossed the street and walked kind of around the block because I didn't want, and it might have been just my fear, but
Yeah.
it's the same feeling I had, Dr. Williams, when I first came to Twin Cities
Mhm.
and lived in St. Paul. My brother was trying to go somewhere in North Minneapolis. I didn't know North Minneapolis, so I was driving him down Plymouth Avenue, west on Plymouth Avenue, and went Thomas, Upton, all the alphabets down to the end. But it
Yeah.
got to the place where you turn the corner and you see the chalet, right? This is back in 19, maybe 71 or 2. And when I saw the chalet emerge from around that bends, panic. This looks like where white people are. And I questioned whether I was placing myself,
Mm.
we were placing ourselves in danger by
Yeah.
being in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this sense of place, comes up. Now,
Right.
contrast that with riding down a mountain in Ghana, the
Mm.
bus, a group, black people. We look out the bus and we see 2 white women. This is midnight, walking down the country roadside at midnight, talking and chatting and having a good time. And I compare that also then to the fact that where I live now in North Minneapolis, a generation ago, black women couldn't walk down Plymouth Avenue, not for fear of black men, but for fear of white men propositioning black women and
Right.
feeling they have the liberty to do that. Now,
Right.
where all this goes and ends up, I'm not sure, but
Right.
these are the feelings and thoughts that
Yeah.
come up from this conversation, Jojo. Any
Mhm.
impressions, thoughts, observations?
Yeah, I just hope people will read her story and again make these Minnesota connections national too. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Williams, what are your
Mhm.
thoughts?
No, I just yeah, it's interesting that the as we have had this conversations, those things pop up for me.
Mhm.
It's like what is your experience given the places that you've lived and the people that you've interacted with? And
Mhm.
as you were talking, Al, I thought about me in Cincinnati visiting a friend mother, and and so we were in a part of Cincinnati where these young white men, 6 white men in a car drove up on the sidewalk to intimidate me, and how that was so different experiences in different places that gave me challenges about
Mhm.
how you can live their life versus living in the city of Detroit.
Right.
Listen, we're out of time. Jojo Bell, thank you so much for being here. What a great conversation. Good to meet you. Any way that Insight News can be part of your research, we'd be glad to. We've got an archive that we think is valuable. And thank you for the book that you've written. The book is Red Stained, The Life of Hilda Sims by Jojo Bell, published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. Get it, check it out, learn about our community, learn about our people locally and globally. Thank
Mhm.
you so much, Jojo Bell. Thank you, Dr. Oliver Williams. I'm Al McFarland. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye bye.